Welcome everyone to our event today. For those of you who are short span of attention, 9-second people, thanks for stopping by. For those of you who are going to stay later, I'm Bob Eichinger, co-founder of Lumminger Limited in the past and currently co-founder of Team Intelligent. Our topic today is one that I have been facing for a long time. That is, what the hell is a high potential? The follow-on to that is, how do you grow leaders? This is sort of a three-dimensional chess issue of how people go through careers and how careers are built. I'm struck personally because I'm going on my 53rd year in the business of talent management. My first assignment out of graduate school in the 60s was to help a large food company that you would know the name of, to help their managers make potential assessments to get ready for the annual review process. Since that, I've written 60 books and articles and created 60 tools on the issue of identifying talent. I've probably given 1,000 presentations to companies and professional groups on that topic. And I find myself now, 53 years later, my current assignment is to help a client, this one happens to be a bank, to help their line managers assess and make calls on potential to get ready for the annual review. It's as if we collectively, and me personally, we haven't done anything in the field of talent management for 53 years. So I'm sort of embarrassed to be talking to you here today because this shouldn't be an open question, but it is. About every 6 months, somebody writes an article in the journal saying that we don't know what high potential is, and that's part of the issue. It's a definitional issue. I don't agree with that because I think for the most part, we know that what high potential means is that the person we're talking about could move to roles or jobs of greater size and greater responsibility and be effective and successive at some future date unknown. And a small portion of them would in fact grow up to be legacy leaders. So if I say of a 30-year-old that I believe they have high potential, I believe at age 45, they could be in the C-suite of a sizable company, or if they're an entrepreneur, to have created Facebook or Apple or Oracle or Google. So I have no doubt about what high potential means, but every 6 months in the journals we all read, somebody makes that comment, and it's sort of irritating to me. After 30 years of working directly with companies and 50 years in the field, I know that high potential is a thing. That is, it exists. Responsible practitioners and academics and consultants and vendors know what it is. We collectively, plus or minus 10%, agree that people of potential have a fairly uncommon set of KSAs, knowledge, skills, and attributes and abilities. In general, we think that that set of common KSAs sort of cluster around cognitive power. If you're going to be at the top of a large international organization, it's going to take some IQ horsepower to deal with multiple strains of information, making very, very high-level decisions backed up by analytical data. We know that learning agility is required because you can't stay what you are at 30. You're going to have to make significant changes and learn new skills by the age of 45 to get there. We know it has something to do with being coachable, of listening to mentors and coaches and going through developmental activities. We know that curiosity and openness have something to do with it. And the latest one sort of to join, cognitive power has already been there. Learning agility has been around for about 30 years. And we now know that legacy leadership requires a pretty substantial amount of EQ. That's more likely in the last decade or so. So all responsible talent management professionals agree, plus or minus 10%, at what exactly is a high potential. So simply stated, high potential knowledge, skills, attributes, and abilities are working against and learning from a series of specific and tough opportunities that over a long career can grow into leadership KSAs. So that's basically what I want to talk about today. We know that leadership success and how do you develop a leader is this thing called potential coming up against opportunities. And we'll talk about that more in a second. I want to start at the very, very beginning, and very is spelled two ways for intentional reasons. It's not a misspelling. And I really want to start at the beginning to understand this concept of potential. And I want to start with babies. Aside from identical twins, all babies are brought into this world and are different in billions of unique combinations. And I say all except twins because we have a lot of research about identical twins who are raised apart in order to deduce what portion of our adult behavior is nature and what proportion is nurture. And we'll come back to that. Now, what we know coming from the latest decade of neuroscience is that all human beings come into the world with some internal programming that help us survive, grow, live, and survive in life. An example of that is facial recognition. It turns out that the brain is equipped with a facial recognition program. You can do camera studies with extremely young infants. They are absolutely fascinated with faces. Technically, from a statistical standpoint, there would be just as high a probability that they would be fascinated with doors or windows or crib sides, but they're fascinated with faces at birth. So that's a pre-programmed thing that the brain does because of the importance of faces. And technically, what we mean by all this is that everyone is born with some predispositions. Predispositions mean that the body, the brain, the synapses, the chemicals, how your brain is structured and organized, the size, the shape, are predisposed to grow and develop in a particular way when exposed to opportunities to grow and develop. So everybody has predispositions. There is a nature-nurture debate that's been going on since I've been in graduate school. The debate is over. Tom Bouchard, who is the person that has done the major twins raised apart studies over the last 35 years, at a recent PSYOP conference he was being given an award for lifelong achievement. said that all of the data he's looked at, all of the data that's ever been done on twin studies, all of the debates, all of the conference presentations have come down basically to a 49-51 percentage. That is 49% of what you are as an adult is due to predispositions meeting opportunities in life. And 51% of what you are and what you do as an adult is based on nurture, family development, education, teachers, coaches, band leaders. That 49-51 differs widely based by characteristic. So IQ, for instance, would be much more nature, whereas the ability to give business presentations might be more nurture. And in order to be smart about this topic, you need to understand the difference between inherited and genetic. Inherited is when you have a characteristic that has been passed on to you from your parents. Genetic means that in the billionth of a second, when your genes came together and reorganized themselves into a person, that may or may not bring with it the math skills of your father or skills of your mother. So we're talking about genetic, not inherited. That's an important distinction. Most all of you know about the twin studies. Just in short, Tom Bouchard in 1979 started studying twins who were separated at birth, both identical and fraternal twins. And when the twins found themselves, the University of Minnesota would get to them and ask them to come in for a week's worth of testing on personality, values, interest, attitude, skills, before they spent much time with each other. And when the twin studies got sort of famous, identical twins who found themselves wouldn't even spend any time together at all. They would directly contact the university. They would travel to Minneapolis and go through the testing before they spent much time together. The scientific question is, are two identical twins raised apart? One in a nurturing, economically comfortable home in a safe suburb, and the other identical twin raised on a farm in a remote community, or even in a situation of poverty. When you looked at them and they took tests, are their tests more like each other, or are they like the environment in which they came from? And that's where the 49-51 comes from. So net findings over all of these years of research says that the finding leads us to believe that similarities between twins are due to genes, nature, not environment, nurture. Given that the differences between twins raised apart must be due totally to the environment, and given that these identical twins are just as similar as identical twins raised together, we can conclude that the environment, rather than making twins alike, are what makes them different. So the nature-nurture debate's been settled. It's 49-51. Some of us, from a values standpoint, don't like that. There are some religious pushback to that, but from a science standpoint, it's a settled issue. It's half and half. Now, in the predispositions that kids are born with, there are some prodigies. There are people who have absolute gifts. You've seen all these stories on 60 Minutes and on 2020 documentaries. These child prodigies tend to be in art, down on the left-hand side, and music, upper left. math, upper right. We've seen these time and time again of the 9-year-old down in the right-hand corner who plays Beethoven flawlessly. We see on the left-hand side an 8-year-old who is selling paintings at $10,000 a piece. We've seen early reading is another place where we get this in the bottom center. There are 2, 3-year-olds who already can read. And then we've got the math whizzes up in the upper right-hand corner. Now you just can't argue 100% nurture, because many times when you watch the documentary of the young infant people or 8 or 9-year-olds that can play Beethoven, neither of their parents are musical. And then you watch the documentaries on the math whizzes, and neither of the parents are very good at math. So 4951 is absolutely documented by looking at all this. And then there's people that really get you irritated. Here's an 11-year-old who is graduating shortly from engineering at the University of Minnesota, is in love with theoretical physics and hasn't decided yet what he wants to be, but he's graduating from the university in engineering, of course, straight A's, at the age of 11. This one happened to be raised by his grandparents, and they are not geniuses. So again, it's another demonstration. And if that one doesn't irritate you, here's a 9-year-old who's graduating in electrical engineering in the Netherlands and is set to start graduate school at age 9. So that's a settled issue, and it's important to understand in terms of what we're talking about in potential. So some kids have gifts, some have talents, some may have special skills. An example of that is brain power. So brain power is heavily genetically impacted. Human beings are born with a IQ predisposition for a target range when they become developed as adults. Depending upon diet and physical health and environment and the functioning of the home, whether it's a nurturing home or not. If everything goes as projected, the predisposed IQ range will come to be. If there is a dysfunction in upbringing, then it could be lower. So that's an example of a pre-programmed capability, which we call predispositions. Another example would be some aspects of personality. Human beings are born with a predisposition toward general personality characteristics. Some are born extroverts, other introverts, some practical and detail-oriented, some dreamers and visionaries. Some are highly interested in socializing and in people, and others, the introverts, are interested in things. So again, unless there's some powerful opposite and extreme condition in their environment, they grow into their predisposition. People can change their predisposition. So for instance, some natural extroverts are born into a complete family of extreme introverts. And my guess, after 18 years of being in that environment, one could imagine that they would become more introvertish than they started. Some very structural, process-based, detail-oriented people are born into families of messy academics and philosophers where there's very little organization in the household. So some thing people are born into a family of social workers, teachers, and pastors and become people-oriented. So it's not that you have to stay what you're born at. but unless there's an extreme something happening in development, you're most likely going to be your predisposition. We're seeing more and more of this in the medical literature. For instance, this is a recent 2019 finding. Babies born with high level of bad cholesterol and certain types of body fat face a heightened risk of social and psychological problems in childhood. So based on their very early genetic design of their bodies, that moves into adult behavior. The same thing can be talked about. Right now, they did a study from a standard blood test taken at birth. You can predict teacher ratings on emotional regulation, self-awareness, and interpersonal behavior 5 years later. There's a whole series of studies on self-management and self-control and delay of gratification. And all of those studies basically say that very early in childhood, you can watch a child's reaction to being asked to delay something they want. And they show early maladaptive outcomes. Those people grow into adults who have problems controlling their emotions and controlling their behavior. Now, there is inherited, that's sort of easy to see. These are two ginger families. That doesn't mean that their behaviors are the same, but you can see the impact of genetic behaviors. In this case, it's a visual genetic behavior that is its hair color, so you can see this. So our viewpoint is that infants are born with a portion of potential. That is, some possess the skills and attributes that are necessary to become a person of high potential later on in life. They have starter kits, Lego sets, Lincoln logs, or predispositions that comes from genetics or nature. When developed in the right way, that is, nurture is supportive, they grow into full-blown leaders later on. Now, at this point in time, other than you Star Trek fans, we don't think there's any inborn K, which is knowledge of the KSA. There doesn't seem to be any preloaded knowledge. We are not the Borg, for you Star Trekkers. So we know for sure that infants bring with them some of the S's and some of the A's that later on turn into high potential. So the practical thing we all deal with in talent management then is the issue of how do you develop someone into a leader? How can you take somebody with potential and develop them into a legacy leader 30 years later? We know what the formula is. It's the right starting stuff. It's 49. And the opportunity to learn and grow, which is 51. So if you want to look at this in a visual way, if this were a 9-point scale, we've got the right stuff on the top, on the horizontal, low, middle, high. So if you just broke down 100,000 people into thirds, and then opportunities on the left-hand side, that is, what's the quality of the opportunities that they're given in life, that'll lead to a 9-point scale. So in order to be a 9, to be a legacy leader at age 45, you'd have to have a very supportive nurture and a very high genetic component of potential. On the left-hand side, sociologists and social psychologists have tried to help understand the quality of nurture. And this is also being used in college admissions to give extra credit to people from challenging or disadvantaged backgrounds get into college. But there are 5 indices that you can look at to judge the quality of the opportunities. So the first one is socioeconomic status. That's been around for a long time. The DIVA index, which is how diverse, intense, how much variety and how much adversity do you have in your upbringing. If you're out in Montana on a ranch and your parents are homesteaders and believe in self-sufficiency, and you don't go into town and you don't go to a grocery store and you don't go on vacation and you don't have internet, then it probably doesn't matter if you've got high potential or not, because it's unlikely that you would get very high on this 9-point scale. Another index that is more recent is QHL, which is quality of home life. If you've got somebody in the family that's disruptive or substance abuse or abusive or anti-education or whatever, we know that the quality of home life and the stability of home life is very important. And one of the things that we're facing in this current virus problem is that as you send school kids home, 20% of those school kids come from low QHL homes. And the good news is that at least for 6 or 7 hours a day, they were put in a school system which is theoretically safer and more nurturing as far as development is concerned. There's real concern on the part of pediatric psychiatrists and psychologists and social workers that these children are going to be sheltered in a bad environment. A very recent one is the NQI, which is Neighborhood Quality Index. That is, when you went outside your home in your developmental years, was it safe? Was it clean of toxic substances? Was there a park? Was there running water? Was there a place for you and your friends to play? And then the last one, which is again a more recent index, is the SSQ, which is school system quality. So you can actually, from a metric standpoint, or even if you were an interview circumstance, you could begin to figure out whether somebody has had a low, middle, or high set of opportunities in the developmental years based on taking a look at questions around these 5 indices. So we know now that it starts with the right inborn stuff, 49, followed by the right opportunity stuff, 51, to develop the KSAs necessary for a full career. We know that knowledge required of leaders is about 90% nurture. Skills and attributes are about 50-50. If you look at the career line, basically starting at 22, baccalaureate, college grad, you spend some time as an individual contributor, some time as a supervisor and manager, and then up in the VP C-suite as a leader in the upper right-hand corner. The research says that there are 3 moderately distinct sets of KSAs. That is, it is worth breaking these 3 career sections down into pieces because the parts are not exactly the same. This can be an organizational career or it can be entrepreneurial. So Zuckerberg followed the same sequence. So far we know that potential is a thing. It's a real thing, it can be measured. We know that some portion of potential is the chance of genetic. 49% of being a potential is probably there in infants. We know that the KSAs required across these 3 areas are pretty much known. And to be practical, I would say there are a number of reputable vendors that have competencies and practices that describe KSAs that are probably plus or minus 10% the same. We all have to use unique names because of copyright law. So on our part in Team Intelligent, we've developed 3 different tools because the literature says that there are really 3 different sets of KSAs. We have broke those KSAs into roles and practices. This is a little different than competencies, and once you see this material, you'll see the differences. So we have a tool called KSAI, which is KSAs of individual contributors. We started this research by taking a look at the roles that individuals are asked to fulfill. And in this case, there are 10. The way to think about this is if you took 1,000 job descriptions of people who are working at the individual contributor level, and you did a cluster analysis of all of the things that those 1,000 individual contributors were asked to do, you would come up with these 10 roles. So if you did a factor analytic study of the activities that individual contributors do, which we call practices, these are the 10 things that you'd see in individual contributor job descriptions. We did the same thing for managers and supervisors. We put those together because the research says that the difference between managers and supervisors have gone away. Probably 10 years ago, there was a meaningful difference between a first-line supervisor and a manager. That as we have flattened organizations, that has disappeared. In the case of managers and supervisors, we looked at 1,000 job descriptions. We did the analytical factor study, and it turns out that supervisors and managers are asked to do 11 things. And then the 30 practices of a manager are built against those 11 roles. At the leadership level, the KSAs of leaders, you do the same study and look at the research, leaders are accountable, are asked to do these 9 things. And the leadership practices is our biggest number. There are 35 of those. So the question then is, how do you learn 30 roles and 92 practices over a span of 30 years to become a legacy leader? And it's a little bit more practical than that because you don't have to do all 30, you don't have to do all 92, depending upon what function you're in, what company you're in, what country you're in, that would differ. So it is some subset of those 30 roles and some subset of those 92 practices. Now, the answer to how that occurs takes us back to babies again, because that's a lot of stuff to learn. And 2 of the things that babies differ on from birth is intellectual power. We've talked about that. And the other one is learning agility. These 2 sets of predispositions and the skills and capacities that are developed in the developmental years drive how much and how fast a person can learn as they interact with these opportunities that we've defined looking at the 5 indices that people face during their developmental period. Now, that's not enough. You also have to look at ambition or need for achievement, because there are people of potential who are in high opportunity environments who choose not to learn anything. So The need for achievement has to be added to the mix of the soup, the talent management soup, because how much do they want to learn? And people are born differently. So our formula is cognitive IQ plus learning agility plus motivation is the beginning formula. All parents know that babies show these early differences in tone, style, personality. I love going to family events where there's lots of cousins and children running around, because there will be two children from exactly the same family, 18 months apart. I know both parents quite well. And as a psychologist, I'm watching them for Thanksgiving dinner or whatever we're at, and they're completely different. They have the same parents. They have the same environment. They sleep in the same room. And they're completely different in tone, style, and personality extremely early in life. So babies begin to experience and learn some of these KSA roles of individual contributors, managers, and leaders, and the practices or skills as they live and play and socialize and work and deal with stress in all of the life situations we're added to. And all of these potential future leaders go through 22 years of this learning environment, starting in childhood and going through preschool and kindergarten, the school system, and eventually college, and added to that is 22 summers of activity. And also other kinds of learning on the left-hand side, which somewhat depend on the richness of the nurture part. So some children never get to go on vacations, some can't afford hobbies, some can't buy a musical instrument, so they can't be in band. But putting all that stuff aside, many children have the opportunity through internships and study abroad and clubs and camps and scouts and 4-H and Grange and vacations and all sorts of things, and extended family. These are all opportunities to learn. After they go through whatever it is they go through, 22-year-olds also differ widely. And they differ, again, we know, by their genetics are different and their nurturing is different. Some have learned many key KSA lessons of life and have started down the path of learning the roles and practices that they're going to need to be a leader. And others have learned less. We know that the learning, and that is why is it that they're different, has a lot to do with learning agility and motivation. That is, there are people who are exposed to high quality developmental experiences, but because they're not high in learning agility, they don't get the lessons of life out of those experiences. Now, the term potential has some political correctness in it. I go into some companies that are anti-elitist who don't like the term potential because some people have it and others don't, and they don't like that. But the word potential comes from the fact that these differences we find in 22-year-olds when people start their first full-time jobs. This readiness and motivation and ability and capacity to learn is basically what we call potential. And if you agree with me thus far, it starts early. Not only does it start early, but it modifies over time. We have a lot of evidence saying that potential can be developed. So you're not sort of caught with being of a particular, you might be a 7 on a 10-point scale on potential as a 22-year-old. That doesn't mean that you can't get to a 10. So potential even is developable over time. Now, So we think potential is a thing. We know where it comes from, 4951. We know that there are developmental quality differences that people are exposed to. We know the 5 indices that social psychologists have created to help us measure that. So we also think we know what high potentials look like. So we know that potential is a known set, an agreed upon in common set of KSAs, that if you could assess them in an interview or observing people, it would predict how a person will respond to high quality opportunities and grow into a leader. We also know that potential starts early and that it's a use it or lose it situation. That is, you have to keep working on it. We have a tool called KSAP. It's the KSAs of how people with potential. And it assesses the markers and drivers and practices that we have identified as potential. We will cycle back to this, but this is the system. There are 12 in the red box. There are 12 markers that all high potential share. And if you were interviewing for potential or observing existing employees for potential, those are the 12 things you would look for. And then the 25 practices off on the right-hand side is potential at a deeper, more detailed level. As we have said, as babies and 22-year-olds differ, experienced individual contributors. So people who have been hired, they've had 2 or 3 full-time jobs. The jobs have lasted 18 months. So 36 to 48 months out in your career, people differ in potential at that point in time. And now the question is not potential to be an individual contributor. The question has shifted somewhat. And we now have beginning research to show that there's 3 kinds of potential. There's potential to be a successful individual contributor, success as a manager or supervisor, and then success as a leader. Those are slightly different chunks of potential. But experienced individual contributors are different in the sense of their readiness to supervise. Another part of the puzzle of how people develop into leaders, based on the studies at CCL and studies that we've done over the past 30 years, has to do with the meme we're all familiar to, is 70, 20, 10, 25. That is the CCL studies where they interviewed successful leaders and asked them to go backwards and tell us where it is they learned these essential KSA skills, developed this formula of 70, 20, 10. And there's a 25 at the end of it because that research and other research has shown that 25% of the lessons of life that lead to KSAs that are needed in leadership come from tough situations that aren't used in a developmental program. So 70, 20, 10 are what you use for development. And then we also know that DIVA is important, that is diversity, intensity, variety, and adversity of experiences beyond the developmental years are important. So all of the research says that 70% of the learnings that lead to being successful leaders come from doing real jobs. We know which jobs teach which practices. 20% comes from other people, mostly bosses, and 10% comes from self-directed learning, workshops, webinars, reading, and so on. As I said, the 70, 20, 10 is a split from the 100% because 25% comes from hardships. One researcher called them crucibles, so the Venice and Thomas study which was sort of like Center Studies, said that we found that every current successful leader had undergone at least one intense transformational negative experience called crucible that was at the heart of becoming a good leader. These are the hardships that leaders report that were crucial to their own development as a leader. As you know, with bad bosses in the red, all of the engagement research and the retention research say that people join good companies and leave bad bosses. About 40% of people report at any given time that they have a bad boss. Now, a bad boss doesn't mean they have a gun and they're shooting people. It means I don't agree with them, I don't like their style, I don't like how they treat people, I don't like their philosophy, or they're incompetent and they're messing with the future of my career, or there may be some ethics or values issues. So bad bosses is a big one. When we present this information to executives, and we put up this chart, and there are 8 things on this chart, we say, look at this, how many of these have you experienced in your career? Almost 80% of bosses say that I have had every one of these things. So these are extremely developmental, past the developmental years up to being a college graduate. You can't plan these from a talent management standpoint, but if you're interviewing to find out if somebody's going to be a legacy leader in the future, using this as a checklist might be useful because the research says they're extremely developmental. So as we're building up, as babies and 22-year-olds differ on potential and individual contributors differ on a potential, their potential is a little different. It's potential to manage others. People who have had 2 or 3 successful management jobs differ in the amount of potential they have to be leaders. And even leaders who are already leaders differ in the amount of potential they have to serve effectively in the C-suite. So to summarize this, we know that there are practices or competencies that all reputable professionals in talent management would agree to, plus or minus 10%. We know what's required of individual contributors, supervisors, managers, and leaders. We know on the left-hand side through 70-20-10 that these roles and these practices are learned by people, mostly through jobs, then through the 8 hardships, then people, mostly bosses, and then self-development or coursework. And we know on the right-hand side that the people who have the highest chance of learning what's necessary to be a long-term leader have potential, and that learning comes through DIVA and VUCA, and those are 2 terms that you've seen a lot. But to review, DIVA stands for diversity, intensity, variety, and adversity of experiences and background and developmental events. You need DIVA to prepare for VUCA, which we've all seen in the last 10 years in the literature. And my version of VUCA is volatility, variety, unrest, unknowns, uncertainty, complexity, chaos, and ambiguity, which, as you can all understand, is the situation we find ourselves right now with the virus, unpredictable. And now we have millions of managers around the planet who are managing under VUCA conditions. And in order to be good at that, they would have had to go through DIVA experiences in the 70-20-10 format in order to be successful as a leader in today's worldwide catastrophe. So again, to summarize, we're all headed to a place in the upper center of the chart. Legacy leaders have to be able to manage VUCA. We all agree, plus or minus 10%, what the competencies, skills, KSAs, practices, whatever you want to call them, we call them roles and practices in team intelligence. How did they get there? They get there on the left-hand side through 70, 20, 10, 25, DIVA. Who are the people who are going to get there? They are the people with potential, as in our measurement of potential. That means that opportunity management on the left-hand side is important. That is 70% of getting legacy leaders ready is career path. That is, what do they need to go through in order to develop the specific skills that are necessary to become legacy leaders? I think this is important enough that we use this name along with talent management, because I think one of the things that's missing in succession planning and talent management, as I'm watching it, is people are not being inserted in exactly the right opportunities to develop the KSA skills to be able to handle VUCA. And it's not that we don't know what these jobs are that they need to go through, it's that the system isn't working. And I have another piece on the 4 things that I think are missing in succession planning, and that's one of the 4. That is, we are not being aggressive enough in putting high potential people through the jobs that we know truly develop. So I think career pathing is the answer. We know the whole system in the middle. We understand the concept. It's a thing. Potential is a thing. Development is a thing. We have an instrument that we can use to measure potential. So my current position is that we now know everything we need to know to hire and to take early in career people with potential who are most likely individual contributors and custom manage and sculpt and couture their career paths and learning opportunities through a series of DIVA jobs with the right bosses to produce effective leaders to deal with VUCA at the C-suite level. So I've been doing this for 53 years, and I think I now know, and you should begin to know, we know everything we need to know to make this thing work. Talking about right bosses, one of the characteristics that we've identified that high potentials need to be is coachability. So people need to be open to corrective critical feedback. They need to make changes when they find a skill or an attribute isn't working right. We also know that bosses differ, and there are very few truly good bosses. So an additional 9-point scale we would have to track in order to make this whole system work is how good is the coach. And we're talking about a coach that's a mentor and good at giving feedback. You could take a scale of coachability. Not all people with potential are coachable. That's a 3-point scale of high, middle, low. Then we take a look at the boss that they're assigned to during their years as an individual contributor or a manager. High, middle, and low, and that derives the 9-point scale. Another thing that is late to the party is neuroscience, or what I would call NeuroAgility. What we're finding is that mindfulness is a new leadership skill. So as most of you know, mindfulness comes out of the history of Buddhism and meditation and Buddha. But there's a secular version of that called NeuroAgility. And the brain is an extremely powerful tool, but it comes with some negatives that have to be managed. And it goes back to that study in childhood of delay of gratification. If you do not allow certain children to play with their favorite truck, they have a temper tantrum. If you follow those children later on in life, they continue to have temper tantrum. Something they want is delayed, a desire is not fulfilled. So there's a whole practice now that's called mindfulness. As you know, many of our larger corporations now have a chief mindfulness officer. They teach mindfulness in their company universities. Most universities now are teaching mindfulness to college students, primarily as a method of managing anxiety and stress of a college career. So mindfulness is a set of known practices. They're basically about managing your brain and nervous system that you can perform at your best. We're beginning to see a lot of this done. The Team Intelligent product line has mindfulness in it, and it also has brain education in it. And we believe it's the newest skill that is required of leaders. Leaders have to be brain smart in order to manage themselves and manage others. So again, sort of as a summary, this whole issue of developing leaders is basically potential meeting the right opportunities. The magic sauce, as we said before, we have developed a tool that has 12 markers. These are common characteristics of people with proven potential. A lot of research behind this. The 25 most common practices that potentials use in order to learn and execute the KSAs of leadership. None of this will be new to you. That is, as you scan the markers and drivers of potential, those of you who have developed material inside your organizations probably have worked with these before. We've done something unique in that we've taken a look at troubles with high potentials. I refer to this internally as troubles with tribbles, coming from Star Trek. It turns out that verified true high potentials who are going to go ahead and create Facebook and Google and Apple and Oracle, they're not perfect people. And as a matter of fact, there are 12 negative things that come along with being a high potential that makes it hard to manage high potentials in organizations. The most common is that they're not patient people. They're a little hard to work with. They don't suffer fools wisely. They are very judgmental about the competency and the contributions of others. We have not purposefully called these derailment because these things don't derail verified high potentials. On the other hand, if somebody had medium to low potential and had some of these 12 characteristics, they would probably be fired. So these are fireable offenses to people without potential. But if you have a verified high potential, verified meaning that not only have they assessed that way using an instrument, but several pairs of bosses have agreed that they are verified high potentials. They are high learners. Many of them have multiple of these 12 troubles with high potentials, and you have to manage around these. They get into political trouble. They don't really believe in being politically correct. They get the office of the general counsel involved once in a while when they say things in public they shouldn't have said. They're very hard on people who don't perform, who come to work and don't want to work hard. So you're going to get into some people issues. So this is I think this is unique. I've not seen this before. And then I talked about the final bonus. That is, even though potential is 49% genetic, even though people may go through the 25 or 22 developmental years in a marginal nurturing environment, even though they're only a 5 on a 10-point scale on potential when they get to us at age 23. The research says that all of these 12 markers and 25 practices can be developed. And our team intelligent tool, the KSAP tool, has developmental resources. So all is not lost if you're a 5 and you want to be an 8. You don't have to stay a low potential unless you want to. Those of you who are academics and want to see this in a more structured research base, you need to read 2 articles by Silser and Church. Church is the head people officer at PepsiCo. And I think Alan Church probably does the best job at this potential management succession planning of any practitioner I know. But there are 2 journal articles, one in 2009, one in 2014, that basically go through all of this reasoning and come up to similar conclusions that you've heard here today, plus or minus 10%. So if you want to read a peer-reviewed version of this in a journal, these are the 2 articles that I would recommend. So thanks for stopping by. We're pretty excited that only because I'm an old person, I think I've figured out what potential is. We know what it is. We know how to assess it. We know how to develop it. We know how to deploy it against the roles and KSAs needed for an entire career. And I've done the hard part. The easy part is for you to implement all this stuff in your company. So good luck, and I'll see you somewhere on the journey.